Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm Becca Bertrand, the Executive Director of the Newport Historical Society, and we're thrilled that you're joining us for this really exciting panel, All Hands on Deck. I'm thrilled to be joined this evening by four very distinguished gentlemen and sailors and maritime historians and tailors, as you can see. Thank you very much there, Adam. As we get started this evening, if you have any questions for our panelists, you can put those in either the chat button at the bottom or the Q&A. If there are questions that are pertaining to some of the things that we're talking about as we're going forward, we may pause and take your questions, but there will be time at the end after we finished our discussion. We have a couple of prepared questions that we're going to be asking, so we may take your questions and put them at the end. So don't worry, we're not forgetting about you. We're just waiting to the very end. So thank you again for joining us for this very exciting panel. I'm really grateful to our partners in this evening's program, the Sailing Museum. If you haven't had the opportunity to visit their incredible facility down on Thames Street here in Newport, I really think that you should take the time to visit the new museum. And we're really grateful for their partnership and their support in this program. So without further ado, I'd like to provide a brief introduction to each of our panelists. First, Lyle Goldstein leads a team of sailors who train and recreate the 1777 Barton's Raid each year, which involves rowing from Warwick Neck to Portsmouth. Then we have Adam Hodges-LeClaire. He's an independent historian and an 18th century tailor who sailed the vessel Hermione across the Atlantic in 2015 wearing authentic historical garments. Then there's Andrew Lyter, who's the executive director and curator for the Lewis Historical Society in Delaware, who's also an avid maritime historian and sailor. And then a master shipwright and former professional sailor, Will Sofrin, who's the author of the new book, All Hands on Deck, a modern high seas adventure for the far side of the world, which chronicles his time sailing on the tall ship Rose for use in the movie Master and Commander. And the book, Will, it came out 2 days ago, right? Yeah, that's really exciting. So get yourself a copy. I have mine right here. And it's for sale in our shop down in the Brick Market if you're in Newport, or commercially available worldwide. So I gave a brief introduction, but I know that you guys have a lot more to say about yourself and your careers and your experience with sailing and with historic sailing. So I thought I'd give you each the opportunity to say a little bit more about yourself. So if we could start with Lyle.
Okay, hi everyone. So glad to be here. I guess I should say at the top, Master and Commander is definitely my favorite movie. I guess that probably goes for most of the audience too, or many. I am maybe a little unusual in this group that I'm not an accomplished sailor, but I'm working on that. But I started this commemoration of what I view as an absolutely critical moment in the Revolutionary War. This is called Barton's Raid, and I guess the very quick version of Barton's Raid is that it occurred at the pivotal moment in the war in 1777 when things were very much in flux, and the idea was to try to snatch a British general. So it was kind of like like a special ops raid. I worked in Naval War College for many years, so I have an interest in military history. Anyway, what we do is we go in kayaks. We don't sail, but we kayakers, and I am a sea kayaker, we share a lot in common with sailors, although we tend to like calmer seas often. But the brilliance of the raid is it uses the geography of Narragansett Bay. And so, being out on the bay so much, I realized the genius of Colonel Barton's plan was that in any conditions, he could follow Prudence Island, which is kind of like an S shape and takes you from Warwick to Portsmouth, because the British general had a girlfriend at the tavern there. And so they went in the middle of the night. They took the British by surprise. They got the general in his pajamas. And no, I don't think anybody was killed, which is great. And it, this actually was a huge boost to the colonial cause because carting off a British general is a huge moment. And again, it happened at a time where things weren't going so well in the war. So anyway, we're thrilled to do this. We've had a lot of challenges. I've had people get really ill, for example, on the water. We used to finish up the paddle at about 2 a.m. Paddling, being out there on the bay at night is very exciting. We've had a few run-ins with freighters and things like that. But I'm trying to do it safely. I'm trying to spread the word. I think this could be big for Rhode Island because the history is absolutely fascinating and involves a lot of heroics. And also getting out on the bay is exciting. And so I'm looking to get more people involved. So I'll put up my email and I hope that there's more interest. People in Rhode Island know we have something called Gaspee Day, where we commemorate the burning of the Gaspee, which is also a huge event, which happened in 1772. We can talk about that, but I think this is almost equivalent in its importance for the revolution. So we ought to follow this as well. So anyway, thanks so much for having me. And I'm just thrilled to share our little story here. Really a big story, actually.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Adam, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so for the last 15 years, I've been working in sort of public history, like history with general audiences with various projects. That started when I was studying over in Scotland. I went to study there and got a history degree, but at the same time that opened access to a few other European sites, working with a Scottish Fisheries Museum and talking about fishing communities on the East Nook of Fife and sailors and fishermen's clothing. And that was really fun because you get to go into schools in Scotland and they think you're a cowboy and you have to break that down and really bring it to them where they're at. But at the same time, I got hooked up with a site in France, Rochefort, a naval base that had been run by the French Navy for hundreds of years, had been built from scratch in this marsh. But it's now this somewhat sleepier town. And they have rebuilt themselves based on tourism by creating a frigate. I'd visited it as a language student, but sort of kept it in my back pocket. And when they called for volunteers after building this for 20 years, $26 million later, they had a boat and it had all been funded by, in large part, the general public. So I applied, but I didn't have any sailing background. So that's the full caveat. I knew how to sew clothing as a history person who often can't shop off the rack, obviously, for that. But I don't know how to swim. So this was all very new. I knew French, but not well enough to function socially necessarily. So it was an education on two fronts. But I sailed with that vessel in 2014 for the sea trials that they undertook in the Bay of Biscay, and then to America from the Canary Islands across to Bermuda and then up in a series of visits. And basically was sort of a public relations educational person because that's what I offered. And this is obviously quite visible. They were incredibly gracious. I put my foot in my mouth constantly over and over and over, but it was an education on all fronts. And since then, I've been working in the greater Boston area, giving tours and doing educational outreach and sort of all other forms of interactive public history. Yeah. So I hope I can add a little bit of color, but also some of the sort of historical empathy that you get from putting yourself in those shoes. I think it's possible to overplay the sort of like experiential archaeology of like, oh, I did it, so obviously I know how it functions. But when you base things on firm research and you spend the money and time to get it right, you end up with a fully functional frigate that can go 12 knots under sail and, you know, has been built to historic specs and it runs. So.
And Adam, while you're sitting here, what are you working on?
I am for Historic Newport. They have a big event coming up this July for the French encampment and garrison that went to go fight at Yorktown. And this is a waistcoat lining made out of glazed linen that was imported from Ireland. So again, details, but hopefully that's not too distracting.
No, it's great. It's great. We appreciate it. And Andrew, what about you?
Hi. Yeah, so I work as the executive director and curator down in Lewis, Delaware at the Lewis Historical Society. Really what brought me here is maritime history. I had an undergrad professor who really was pushing that you can't just go to college and then work in a museum or teach. You really need to have some experience, some meat to really back up what you're sharing. And that really sunk in with me. He had a past career at Mystic, of course. And sort of I started volunteering on various historical vessels, just trying to get that experiential component to the stories I'm trying to share and the history I'm reading. So while I work in the museum world as a professional white collar museum guy, I like to try to spend my time volunteering at various historical societies and aboard all these different vessels. So I've not gotten to sail across the Atlantic like Adam, sadly, but I've done a few stints on various ships. I was mostly volunteer on the Kalmar Nickel. It's the state ship of Delaware, really wacky Dutch pinnace. It's in addition to that, the Lord Nelson, she's now for sale, but she was based out of England. I got to sail around the UK aboard her. So really my goal is just to take all of these kind of different ways to come at history and experience history and condense this down into a more palatable but fuller understanding of our maritime past, if that makes sense. So I like to ramble too, so I'll cut myself off.
No, that's great. That's great. And finally, Will.
Well, thanks for having me. It's I love the Newport Historical Society. Where did I start? I'm a graduate of the Irish School of Technology and Trades. Graduated in class of 2001 when Ruth Taylor was the president of IRIS. And after IRIS, I thought it would be more fun to sail boats than build them or restore them. But I used my new skill set as a builder to get myself positioned on boats that required major refits, but then I would become part of the crew. And that intimate knowledge gave me an advantage as a crew member on the ship when it was underway. So I'm here because I've got my new book that's just been released called All Hands on Deck, and it's about me sailing the American tall ship Rose from Newport, Rhode Island to San Diego, California, to make the movie Master and Commander, which is based on a 20-book series written by a famous author named Patrick O'Brien. And the series is framed around the friendship of Captain Jack Aubrey and Stephen Matron during the Napoleonic Eric Wars. And I think what makes my book sort of stand out on its own is that the book it's unusual sort of to experience what we went through on Rose, having sailed through force 12 storm conditions, which are hurricane conditions, and then we just masted the ship under full sail in the Caribbean Sea. So it was a wonderful opportunity to kind of explain these rare, tumultuous experiences that don't really happen these days on the tall ships that are sailing around.
Yeah. It's really amazing. Well, I'm very humbled by all of your experiences, and really interested sort of in what, brought each of you to these interests. And so Lyle, something you didn't mention is that you're actually an expert on China. And so it's curious that this became your passion project. So did that become because of your interest in the sport of kayaking, or how did you kind of stumble across this story and decide this is the thing, this is what I'm going to do?
Yes, it is a bit of an odd hodgepodge, and forgive me, I am very jet lagged because I just got back from a trip to China and Taiwan and South Korea a couple of days ago, so my head is somewhere over the Pacific, I think. But I guess what brings it all together is I worked for the Navy for 20 years, and I led the China Institute at the Naval War College. So I think the modern history is all about the development of trade and commerce over the seas, and understanding the history of Asia, that's also critical. And I must say, when I was just in China now, and it's my first time to Asia in 5 years because of the pandemic and everything, but I took a little time in Shanghai, one of my favorite cities, which is very much a maritime city. And I went down to the Maritime Museum in Shanghai, which is spectacular. I mean, another time, maybe I could offer a lecture just on that museum. It's stunning. They have a gigantic sailing ship, built into, it's like takes up 3 stories of the museum. It's a, restored Chinese junk. And that doesn't even begin to scratch the itch here if you're interested in Asian maritime history, because of course, those of you who know Chinese history or maritime history, you know about Admiral Zheng He, who, before Columbus was sailing the largest, I think, sailing ships ever built. There is a little bit of overlap, but to me, I think what brings us all together is we love being out on the water. Brings us closer to nature. And so this using Barton's Raid as kind of a way to get people out into nature, get some exercise, have an unusual experience. I mean, doing some serious sea kayaking at night is really quite, especially around Newport, where it can get pretty rough, as everybody knows. That's pretty darn exciting. Although I think sailors are just so brave, and hearing about what Will and Andrew and Adam are up to is really awe-inspiring. And I'm actually getting much more into sailing these days. I realize that's where the real excitement is. not to a diss on sea kayaking or anything, which is fun too, but
yeah. Do you have any navigation equipment with you when you're out there, or?
That is, in a way, I'm glad you asked that, Becca, because we don't need navigation equipment, because the raid is so logical. You really are, the crossings over wide expanses of water are quite narrow because of this shape of the island. So you really can see how Colonel Barton, in his mind, he put it all together and said, I can do this no matter what. And by the way, they didn't do it in sea kayaks, obviously. They did it in whaling boats with muffled oars. But they had to, let's remember, they were going up against the British Navy. And that's why the British Navy was obsessed with Newport, because it was such an ideal base for, they could have the deep water and so forth. So, they had their frigates patrolling. And but this is one reason, as a kind of military or naval strategist, it's such an incredible case study of kind of asymmetric warfare and really, using your strengths, which was their knowledge of geography. So no, we don't need navigation equipment. We do bring, some radio, Coast Guard beacon, things like that, so that we can, if we get into trouble, and we have had trouble. I think one of the trips across, it was like 1 a.m, and the woman next to me was puking her brains out because I think she had just eaten something badly, but I had to get her boat back across, and that was interesting, but she did okay, and we made it. So.
Oh my gosh. I imagine that's something that you all share in common.
Yeah, I would think I'm probably not the only one who's dealt with that issue.
Yes, and storms, bad weather. And probably for someone like Adam, storms in historic clothing is probably not the best situation for you.
So again, as an experiment, I wore the clothing that I'd researched and I and some other tradespeople put together for the project. Some of it was comical because, big heavy wool overcoat gets wet and your entire watch on duty starts baaing at you out of the blackness because you smell like a wet sheep. But fundamentally, I think it stood up because, like, if you're wearing a, impermeable rain slicker in mid-July because it's a, chucking thunderstorm, whatever, then you're going to be wet because you're sweating on the inside into, again, a rubber seal. And I'm wet because I'm damp, but again, just natural versus synthetic fibers. And especially when you're dealing with historical conditions, say around black powder weapons, but we didn't do too much of that. Like if you have rubber or plastic next to a cannon or next to an open fire, then these things catch up with you. Honestly, that was the least scary part for me. And I'd like to hear what these guys were maybe intimidated by or what they've been afraid of in the course of their time at sea. For me, the challenge was less about the clothing, because that's what I was good at. It was more the social factor of learning a new language, and then the technical challenge of being in a maritime environment and trying to, learn something beyond just how to, bust rust or paint. This isn't group therapy, but does everybody else have something that they were intimidated by or afraid by? For me, it was being culturally literally out of water.
I wouldn't say that passage on the rows that I was really afraid of too much, or was intimidated. I think it was naive and green. And now the more sailing I've done over the years as I've gone through, I have that context and experience where now when I'm out sailing, I would say I'm not more fearful, but I'm more cautious and paying attention to all the variables that are going on and trying to make sure that everything's humming the way it's supposed to be humming. If that makes sense.
Would you do it again, Will?
Maybe
I guess that's a hard question. Would you do it again if you were the same age, or?
I would, because it was a terrible, incredible experience all at the same time. And I mean, the point of me writing this book was my hope. I read some great books when I was in high school by some wonderful authors like John Krakauer and Thin Air and Sebastian Under the Perfect Storm. And those books were an impetus for me that inspired me to feel confident about taking a path less traveled instead of going to college, attending a vocational school and going to Iris. And I had a lot of negative peer pressure for making that decision in high school. A lot of my friends, everyone told me I was making a big mistake with my life. And I think that today we're on a sort of a wobbly point here in society where maybe too many people are going to college and not enough people are going to vocational school. I think continued education is imperative, but I hope that maybe some young readers will read this book and they'll feel more confident about the decision they choose to make for their life.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. Andrew, I wonder what you think about that as someone who kind of lives in both of those worlds, because you're a practitioner, but you're also an academic.
Sure. Yeah, it's I sort of feel like an imposter in both worlds. I mean, it's one of those where every voyage I do, even now, I don't do it on a daily basis. So the first week, it's just getting my kind of back up to par and feeling like, okay, I'm now an asset for this crew. I remember everything. By the end of the voyage, I'm great. I feel like I could do it for a living. But then months might go by or years, and then I try to sail again, just trying to jumpstart my brain. So I think, but all of those things are historically would have been faced, would have sort of encountered. I like to look at myself as the lifelong like landsman, maybe an ordinary seaman on a good day. It just puts into perspective, I mean, how staggering this maritime nation was. I mean, just the humans and just the knowledge that these people possessed. I hate the trope historically of, they were so much dumber back then. It's like, no, these were brilliant individuals. These are vast, complicated machines that are propelling themselves across the ocean with just harnessing nature. So I think it does put that into perspective, if that helps at all.
I mean, to tie into what you said there, Andrew, a ship like Hermione or Rose were, in my opinion, equivalent to Elon Musk's spaceships today. These were these machines that were the most advanced technology, and they were going out to a new part of the world that was completely unknown and unsure of. And compliment what you're saying, the crews had to be able to be competent enough to do anything or whatever it took to survive. They had to rebuild, forage, survive.
It highlights what you're saying, Will. I mean, with such a surplus of academics sort of and lack of practical trade experience today, some of these individuals historically, they couldn't sign their name or read to save their life. You'd see their mark on, maritime documents, but they knew how to rig a vessel and just really harness this massive, complicated machine and sail across oceans. So it's really what we value societally has shifted a bit too.
Definitely. And I think, an interesting thing that also unites all of you is that you all had to train for this or be trained like trial by fire. And, in the case of poor Adam, you just kind of got thrown in there. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, if it's better to be well-trained or not well-trained, if it's sort of something you just need to kind of learn on the fly, or if there's any preparation for something like a bad storm or a weak stomach. I guess I sort of wonder, what would have happened to you, Adam, if you got out there and you realized like, oh, actually, I get really seasick. This is not going to work out for me.
Yeah.
Let's see.
So the organization that I volunteered with, they formed 80-person crews at every interval of the voyage out of a body of, I think, about 300 plus volunteers. So that was the bare minimum to sail the vessel. Each one of those volunteers underwent a competency training even before they got into that after being selected. And that included climbing to the main yard and just, do you have vertigo? Okay, well, you can take part in this, but not as a sailor. And everyone, because of the smaller number of crew, needed to be able to go aloft and furl or reef or whatever in case there was some kind of emergency or someone fell overboard. So, I mean, that was the baseline, but everyone was able to meet that. And it was this beautiful teaching between professional seamen and women that are in the merchant marine or in the fishing fleet or do, again, professional work on yachts or whatever, that were able to instruct volunteers over time within the shipyard and then throughout the voyage to be more and more competent. So that was beautiful. But it was this weird this contradiction as well between people in the merchant navy who spend their lives at sea for real, but in essentially like an office building that's on water, and then like all of us being out on deck, really more exposed to the weather. So two things helped me because I was very afraid at certain points, like furling on the main to gallant, which is like several stories above the deck at sea at night. But it was that the closer you are to land, the more risk there is. And maybe Lyle can speak to that, because obviously having a vantage point in a sea kayak is great, but also like there's more to strike against or to be sucked against. But then the second expression, which was from the captain, so please don't quote this, was, if you piss in the wind, you'll rinse your teeth.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So
That's wise.
So again, just taking a certain measure of humility and humor. I think I was trained as well as I could have been, but I wasn't very, again, like Andrew said, useful until the end when you build up a certain level of experience.
I'll chime in with, I think a lot of tall ships, that industry today for non-professional mariners, for your volunteer crew, folks like that, obviously we're required to go through pretty robust training regimes. Kalmar Nickel is hands down the finest training I've ever done in any capacity, be it at sea or professional organization. And we have crew refreshers via Zoom. So there's 150 of us on a Zoom crew refresher, just going over small logistics, like how to encounter the futtock shroud, wearing a different harness so the swing radius, you won't get struck. And it's really minute details that we all comprehend. But then this Saturday, I have my in-person training. So we'll have to do our new climbing test, all of our safety classes, everything that you need for the Coast Guard. So I think that baseline,
Coast Guard. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So that baseline can be established, but as Adam said, there's things that I don't think you can train for until you encounter it. I mean, you're not going to know how your stomach is, or you're not going to know how excited you are to see a whale off the Stellwagen bank. I mean, there's experiences and things that just can't be prepped for. So,
yeah. No, go ahead, Will.
I mean, my experience, my book is 2 decades old, and I know that the world of tall ships has come a long way, even in the last 20 years, where a lot of safety standards have changed. And I think my story is unusual because we also weren't operating as a sail training vessel. Tall ships have to be a tall ship, you have to be a nonprofit. It's an educational setup, and we were bought by a private entity for a purpose. So having 30 professional crew members on the ship with the mission of getting it from A to B was a unique task and a different environment. But we didn't have any time to prepare to learn how to sail. So fortunately, there was a good number of the crew members who'd already sailed the ship before. But what did help us was sort of all the preparation, the yard that went into getting the ship ready. That, I think, preconditioned us to how to work together, which definitely gave the officers a great leg up when we got underway is sort of everyone knew how to work together, but we just needed to kind of fill in the pieces on how to operate the sales. And again, that was maybe just for half the crew, myself included.
Definitely.
If I may, I'm kind of curious with Andrew and with Will, where you can teach a child how to coil a line. You can learn a lot of these applied skills as volunteers or as, professionals, obviously doing it as a vocation. But there were moments on the voyage I was with, and similar in scale to Calmer-Nickel or to the Rose, where the modern logistics or legality of things were more challenging. Because, for instance, we waited for 3 weeks in essentially dry dock in La Palisse in France because our engine props that were added for modern docking standards could not be opened or repaired except, or if we were to do that with the mechanics on board, which I wasn't one, obviously, it would void the warranty of this company in Italy that had sailed. So like checks and balances that are put in place by larger entities that make your job or your experience more complicated. Because like a pulley or a block, like it's going to work until it doesn't. And if it doesn't, you can fix it. Where the modern world catches up with you, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
I don't, we didn't have, I'll say for, my experience, we didn't have any sort of hold up like that. Our biggest hold up was the weather, and then we had continual failures. But the universal mentality that we had was whatever it took to get the job done. Did have some terrible failures along the way. Also, we had our engines came hydrolock because water had backfilled the engines, and that was a precarious situation. But I don't know what to say to that.
Yeah, I think, maybe I know you mean as modern logistics as a detriment almost, but I think it's more of a good thing. I know on various voyages when we've faced bad storms or anything like that, we have the luxury of firing up the engines and getting into a harbor so that we can wait it out, because we know that we need to be in export in 4 days for 2 public voyages and an appearance at this dock. So I think it just changes sort of the nature of, these voyages. Some folks do them to connect with the past and experience this sort of nostalgic going to sea. But logistically, these are modern entities that are nonprofits, as Will pointed out, that they need to make money and ensure the safety of their crew and their passengers. So yeah, it has gotten in the way in that respect. Little things too, like refrigerators and inspections that you have to fix something before you can leave dry dock. I think that always will get in the way with the modern conveniences, but maybe historically we would have been facing different difficulties that I guess we could accept as we're more in tune with the historical nature of these vessels.
And I should clarify, I'm fully behind any of the professional standards, safety, logistics, etc. Even just meteorology, like knowing what the weather is going to be, regardless of whether you start up the motor, is incredibly powerful. But just that balance between how far a ship is adapted or has to adapt to remain either functional in sailing practice or safe, economical, whatever, as a modern entity.
Well, does it make sense to consider? I think an argument that I've always enjoyed when I talk about past versus present is coming from the wooden boat world. Do you employ using epoxy and modern technologies when you're building a boat or restoring a boat? And what I found as a solid footing is if epoxy was available 100 years ago, Nat Herreshoff would have used epoxy in his America's Cup boats. Right. And so they were using the most advanced technology they had. Just because we had engines, electricity, and plumbing on Rose doesn't mean that we didn't experience with the sail. We still had to trim the sails and set them just like everyone did 200 years ago. There were no push button winches or self-furling square sails. I'm kind of curious about Lyle, how because you guys do the kayaks instead of the traditional whaling boats, do you feel that that has taken away from the experience that you're creating with your recreation?
Yeah, that is a good point. it has crossed my mind, and I have seen people in sort of like period boats that would be probably more similar. You know, they had larger crews and whatnot. But the kayak is a wonderful vessel. You know, I'm very, although I admire sailors very much, I'm very proud to be a kayaker, and that they have some advantages. And one of the advantages is that we are, very comfortable inshore and around rocks and we really can, the conditions can be quite diverse that we can handle, including very rough seas as we've experienced. So I view our effort with Barton's Raid as really an exercise in getting close to nature, but also an exercise in patriotism. I think a lot of people forget why we had the revolution, and how we did it, and that it was a very long and terrible war in many ways. So I think it's important to remind ourselves occasionally why we did that. So I'm excited about that. But actually, I have back to you, Will, and I have a few other comments on tall ships and training and the Coast Guard and things like that. If we can discuss those things later, but I have to ask you, having made that, I guess, incredible journey that not many sailors have around, what is it, the Cape Horn, right?
Yeah, we went through the Panama Canal.
What's that?
We went through the Panama Canal.
Oh, you went through the Panama Canal. Oh, okay. Well, anyway, without giving too much from your book, though, can you describe that conditions of that terrible storm you said?
Yeah, I mean, it was. I'm going to go back to being. It was great to be as naive as I was, because I like rough weather, and I was having a great time. And fortunately, as a deckhand, I was lowest rung on the crew in regards to responsibility. Now knowing what I know, and especially getting to interview all my shipmates for this book and get to hear everyone talk about their perspective, I was really surprised about how many people told me they really thought that we were going to sink. That was very shocking to me.
Yeah.
And some of them made peace with God and didn't think it was going to work out. And that thought had never crossed my mind when I was there. I was having a good time with it. And it was intense. And the wind, and there's a scene in the book where one of the square sails starts to come unfurled, and I have to go aloft to furl. And everyone gets, I find a lot of people get uncomfortable on the deck of a boat when you tack it and the boat rocks and it goes from side to side, but it's completely different when you're 60 feet up in the air and the ship's doing 60-degree rolls from that high up. When you talk about the arc and how fast the velocity that you're swinging that high every 4 to 5 seconds, that's very intense.
The fact that the yard isn't static on the mast.
Yeah.
I wouldn't make it. It wouldn't work out for me. I really admire you guys.
But I mean, I'm intrigued by Adam, because I already thought it was hard enough doing what we were doing, but then putting the period clothing on while you're doing it, that is, I thought, wow, new level for
that. That was something that they gave me a lot of latitude with. Several of the officers and I had a conversation about safety. Obviously, I was wearing a harness for modern legality, and I would have continued to wear that. But like, if you have leather tread shoes that are on traditional hemp rigging, everything works out. I never found that it was a hindrance other than just bulk and maintenance. The one thing I'll say, because I can go into detail about the clothing and how it wore, is that it was more about the mindset of working with traditional technology, like you're saying, hauling on a line instead of it having, a push button that does it automatically. It forced you to work as a team. And, modern people are very individualistic. A lot of the time, that's how we think of ourselves. It's the reason why I was dressed like this, because I'm an individual. This is my thing. but like once nature's there and it really humbles you with the force of what can happen at sea, it's like, no, like I cannot haul this and, you know, belay it at the same time. So it is not a challenge. It's an incredible project in the harbor, but I would be interested if you're able to use whale boats that have to be rowed in tandem, whether that would change the experience of having to work in unison rather than as individuals. Because obviously you're having to support each other as you paddle. And I love kayaking, but I think it really changes it. And for a lot of the volunteers, at first, when you first start doing it, it was very dysfunctional of like, no, I can haul on this line. Like then some seamen laughing at you because they know better. Or like when you go in a small boat and you're rowing and like it's going all over the place because you don't know, you have to work together. It's not about ego. It's not about strength. That I think was one of the biggest lessons beyond just cultural immersion and the sort of.
I like where you go with that, Adam, because I think one of the big draws or lures or I don't know, the takeaway for me with this is it's about learning how to work together and being with the people that you're with. And, you know, we're describing period clothing or storms, but I don't think we'd have these, we wouldn't be here if also we weren't having a great time doing what we were doing and having a lot of fun. And if people weren't having a lot of fun, there wouldn't be so many programs around the world doing this. And I think, like Lyle, you've been able to, I'm guessing you came up with the idea to recreate this on your own, and you built this following because people are having fun doing this sort of version of a recreation of an event.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I'm trying. I can't call it a full up success. We're not nearly where I'd like to be. I mean, in my dreams, yeah, I have experimented with taking some younger people on the trip. Because I think I myself have already realized I'm a bit old for all this. In fact, we used to do, you know, it basically would be 25 miles and we would start at about 7 p.m., you know, when the sun was setting because it was a night raid, and we would finish at like 2 a.m. And, you know, that would be, you know, for somebody my age, that's already pushing the limit, frankly. But I got some younger folks to come on, and they were like, you know, no problem, you know. So, but anyway, it's definitely, you know, I think it's a challenge for all of us is how to get the younger generation pumped up about all this and excited. And you know, to me, this is very important, and partly, you know, because I think both sailing and kayaking both are a way with interacting with nature and history that are, you know, that are, how to put it, environmentally friendly, and that I think is very important to young people, and it should be. It's their future. So that's one thing. One comment on clothing, though, I got to say, as a kayaker, I'm a little bit intrigued by the whole, you know, we draw our past from the experience of Native Americans and Eskimos, chiefly Greenland, indigenous peoples, you know, and I have seen a lot of people now paddling with these, they call them Greenland paddles. But, you know, I'm just shocked and amazed that Eskimos could survive in that hostile climate. They could do the Eskimo roll like it was nothing. They had the seal skin, you know, to deal with the incredible cold, but it just blows me away that they were out there in that kind of weather. And I guess one question for Adam maybe would be how when did sailors first transition over to something that would, you know, not absorb the water or whatever, you know, I guess what we would call like a wind jacket or whatever, you know, with the standard.
So just after the revolution, especially in Europe, you start to see the first commercial oilskins, as we call it. So
oilskins, yeah. What is an oilskin? What did that mean?
So it's linseed oil or other mixes impregnated into cotton canvas. And they figured out ways to make this in a way that was stable and it was inflammable and or wouldn't explode, whatever. Okay. And
yeah, important.
That meant that people could go to a store and buy like a sou'wester and, you know, a big smock, etc. But there's other earlier versions of that with, you know, wax sheepskin coats or whatever. Because I worked on this boat in period clothing, but also because I taught at an outdoor school and used ocean canoes and a little bit of kayaks as well, I would argue nothing is waterproof, and that if it is that impermeable, it's just going to take longer to dry out. But that said, again, with the bravado of someone who did this to a much younger, more joie de vivre body of, an 18-year-old, like Will was saying, you have a different mindset to it. Yeah, I find that the period clothing never failed me per se. It just took a lot more care to maintain, just like, hemp rigging will take much more maintenance than Hempex or steel cable, whatever. I'm curious if everybody else felt like this has been a universally feel-good thing, because you're talking about engaging folks, and the Hermione was, in many respects, and it's still an ongoing project, sort of an instance of like history that wasn't ever bad. It was like America being helped by France, this frigate and Lafayette, not problematic figures per se. All of this is old history. Like British people weren't complaining that we were, demonizing the King George III, whatever. So how do you teach these stories in a way that's modern, inclusive, and also honest? So like in researching the Hermione, like it's broadcast as Freedom's Frigate, and that's a good tagline. But like the Captain Latouche was a 30-year-old who came from the French islands and had a slave, and squaring that circle of an inspiring story that's feel good in the modern day, but has murkier elements to it, or just making sure that you're talking to people where they're at. I guess.
And that sort of actually will, if you guys answer that question, that kind of relates to a question that was asked by someone in the Q&A, which is sort of talking about, the question comes in saying, spanning the historical and practical aspects of sailing traditional rigged vessels, how would you continue to generate interest in these areas with the general public? Which was also something you talked a little bit about, Lyle, you brought that up. So just sort of as being a little mindful of the time as you're talking about that, if you want to talk about how we kind of keep this alive and interesting to the public and to younger generations. Thoughts?
Well, I mean, I think it is difficult, and I can't say I've had a really easy time. And I just, I guess I have to get much better at the PR. But I mean, to me, the challenge of getting the public interested and young people interested, we have to, I would like to see, again, I think in New England, there is a lot of interest in maritime history and sort of local Revolutionary War history. And so my son was just doing a big event in Concord and Lexington, which is great. But I mean, I would like to see the state of Rhode Island take up Barton's Raid as like a major event in our history. And I had thought like one strategy I was thinking of using was trying to get, I had some connections with the Rhode Island National Guard. To me, because of the military aspect of this, would be great to have them, do this as like an annual event. And I think we could build on it from there. Just one quick comment on inclusivity and all that is just to say that I have noted that in the revolution in New England, a lot of African Americans were involved, including at Bunker Hill and actually in Barton's Raid as well. So, that was a piece of it actually, which is really interesting and important to remember. We were really all in this together.
I think
I should probably clarify. It was more, especially to you as an academic and to Andrew, who's also deeply involved in that world, how you choose and celebrate certain maritime stories or voyages or vessels, whether it's Captain Cook, whether it's a Revolutionary War battle or other voyages of exploration and maritime adventure in an honest post-colonial way. I guess. Let's, for instance, there's a Swedish ship, the Gothenburg, which is going to China currently on its second voyage. And again, that's sort of a really feel-good mission of connecting two cultures and saying what that might mean today. And you pointing out that, the men who took part in this historically were from a variety of backgrounds and not purely lily white. I think that's key if you want to engage more than just sort of the typical audience.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Adam, I think that weakness and that we've not done a good job in being inclusive and providing a voice for those diverse groups is also the greatest strength in how we can connect with a wider audience. Look at a ship's muster book and how diverse the crew was. Look at the languages that would have been spoken, or a port that is involved in international trade. I mean, this is a melting pot culturally. And I think that that's how we can connect with different people. This is a very random aside, but I'm currently going down a rabbit hole trying to figure out what did the seafarers, what was the ethnic breakdown, the social history of sailors in the maritime town I live in 1804. So I'm going through seamen's protection certificates, chasing out descriptive details of these fellows, and it's the findings are not going to sit well with the current demographic. It's a retiree community, predominantly white. They're all members of the yacht club, and this port town was extremely diverse and full of people from all over the world, tattooed. It was really not the crowd you think you would find in such a luxury resort town, but that's how we make this matter to these groups that have not been included in this narrative in the past. I was talking to my tattoo artist and shared some of this research with him. He's like, "Oh, that's really neat. If you guys ever share that history, I'd come out." And I think that's our job, is just using this as a platform to bring in people from different vocations and disciplines. So I'll hop off my soapbox now.
Lyle, I wonder if you, because I think we may have a lot of Rhode Islanders on the call. So I wondered if you want to describe a little bit about what your program looks like and some ways that people could get involved. If it's still structured that you need to be kayaking at 2 o'clock in the morning, or if there's opportunities for for people to get involved either on the water or on land. If you need volunteers or maybe help with
That's
your.
great. Well, yeah, I mean, I should have thought about that more. I have like a whole plan to present or something like that. But I mean, I do want to keep the integrity of it. But we did modify it a little bit so that now we head out in the evening and we camp overnight down in Portsmouth or on Prudence, and then we come back. We found that's a lot safer, and that way you don't have to be 18-year-old and fearless, but you can be so it's I think a lot safer, because 12 miles is a lot more manageable. We also have made it, we basically follow the weather. We don't just go. We used to just go, and that we found is very dangerous, because it just it can be really 15 miles an hour is great sailing weather, but not good sea kayaking weather. So but I mean, I would love to have some support boats, some safety boats around. And we also our first year, we didn't follow up on this, but I'd like to do more. We actually had people in period costume meet us, and we had some nice speeches. We had a historian kind of lay it all out from the Portsmouth Historical Society. So I do think we could turn this a little bit more into kind of a festival, following the pattern of the Gaspee events, which are terrific, but I would love to see Newport as a city kind of embrace this, since it happened right nearby. After all, that was what the general who was snatched, that's what he was protecting, that jewel of Newport. So that's great. Well, one last comment on kind of this great discussion about inclusivity and spreading goodwill. And I do think sailing is unbelievably good at that, just as a kind of naval person. The fact of tall ships everywhere. And I happen to notice that the Chinese Navy, which I happen to know way too much about, but had been building a tall ship, wanting to get involved. I know that, for example, Mexico has some amazing tall ship. But I do think this is a kind of amazing way for different countries to interact, and it doesn't just have to be the European countries, but actually, the whole world, as we're seeing. So, I hope this continues in that fellowship among peoples, who have been on the seas in various ways, but can be accelerated. I do think maritime museums are critical in this aspect. So I'd love to, help make some connections with these Chinese maritime museums. But, I've been to other maritime museums recently, like in Germany and, all over. So this is a great event today. And thanks for having me. But
Yeah, that's great. And just one real quick last question for everyone, which came in the chat. What is something that you experienced at sea that surprised or amazed you? And then after that, we'll conclude. Let's start with Adam. No, I'm skipping you. Okay. We will start with Andrew.
I enjoyed sailing around from Poole, England up to Oban and then over to Leith in Scotland. And after hitting some storms in the Irish Sea, we were coming by the Isle of Jura. And I mean, the distillery is one of my favorite scotches, but between the Isle of Jura and I think it's by Argyll and Bute is the Corrie of Wrekin. It means the cauldron of speckled seas in Gaelic. It's the third largest whirlpool in the world. And it's just, I mean, perfectly flat seas, and then you have this massive bubbling cauldron of water. And it just, I mean, sailing by that in such close proximity, I didn't know it was there until we passed it. That was pretty cool. And knowing that that was there historically. So hundreds of thousands of sailors traversing the Irish Sea would have encountered this and had the same experience and hopefully been awestruck by it. So
Yeah, that's amazing. Lyle?
Gosh, well, one thing I experienced being out on the bay at night so much and paddling, you know, you'd be like completely exhausted and maybe facing rough conditions, and it's hard to see the waves at night. And as a kayaker, you really have to see the wave right so you can hit it right. And but I remember focusing, you know, looking up and looking at the stars, and I sort of obsessively was looking at what I thought was a star, but then realized it in its redness that it was Mars indeed, and that, you know, so I was just fixated on Mars and you know, in a way that I never would have normally. And anyway, that made it a very exciting experience, you know, bonding with nature and just, you know, being able to see the sky in a way that you can maybe only see it on the water.
Yeah, that's great. All right, Adam, you got it?
Being off of Castine, Maine, historically where the frigate Hermione had patrolled and skirmished with a number of British vessels, and being able to see the privateer Lynx off of our bow, and then be able to reach to my VHF and be like, Charlene, we have an American privateer. It looks like 6 12-pounders, I think. And she's like, shut up, Adam, we know they're there. You know, just like having a serendipitous encounter in the same spot where something happened that you'd studied, but now it's real.
Yeah. And Will?
And nobody's dying, and that's the beautiful part.
No one's dying.
It's a feel-good moment where you can celebrate national history, but it doesn't end up being toxic or
I'm going to say the profound smell of land. When you've been at sea for long enough, you lose that sense, and after days and days, eventually you get close to land, and when you can smell land, you can smell it from even a couple of days out and get the sense and the freshness of how that smells. And then I don't know, I'll tie that into the success of you cross a great distance on the ocean on a ship, one of these ships, and you're not a passenger, which is unusual. Most people who travel today, when we fly in planes or buses or trains, we're all just passengers. We're not participating in the getting from A to B. So I think that there's a great feeling of success and accomplishment when you cross a great distance and you were part of the mechanism that achieved that goal.
Yeah, amazing. Well, thank you all so much for joining us this evening. And thanks, you guys. You have been wonderful panelists, and this has been a really amazing conversation. You didn't even need me to moderate it because you moderated it amongst yourselves. And again, Will's new book, All Hands on Deck, came out 2 days ago. You can purchase your very own copy at the Newport History shop down in the Brick Market, or purchase it wherever you might be across the country. Again, thanks to our amazing partners at the Sailing Museum, and we're very grateful to all of you for joining us this evening. And again, thank you very much to our wonderful panelists. So thank you so much and have a great night. Thanks, guys.